Welcome to our training on the role of the family in the care process. We have a number of trainings that we hope you will find helpful on the CARECT Resource Center that go into more detail about the overall view of the care process, services and supports available to respondents in the care process. And this specific module will focus on the role of the family as we go throughout. So let's look at what we will cover today. So an overall agenda, we have two major sections here. So going into what those different roles of the family in that care process, talking about family as a petitioner, family as a volunteer supporter, and then an informal support role, which may make sense for some family members. And then the second half is focusing on action steps for families and some learning objectives today. So by the end of this module, we hope that you will have an increased ability to define the key concepts related to the family's role in the CARE Act, and then outline some key action steps that family can take. The goal isn't that families are on their own, but we really want to give you some action steps of things you can do. It can often feel frustrating if you feel like you can't make progress or can't contribute to a loved one's care. So we really want to discuss ways that you can participate. That isn't to say that we don't think families are doing enough. We'll talk today about how often families are doing a lot. And the CARE Act is here to provide stronger support for people that are experiencing schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. And the goal of this module is to help families understand what their role is in that. So before we jump into the content, I wanted to introduce today's speakers. Pleased to be joined by Barry Jacobs from Health Management Associates, Linda Mims, and Shay Franco-Clausen. So Barry is a clinical psychologist and family therapist, and his specialty is enhancing support for family caregivers. He's an expert in behavioral health integration, complex care management, and enhancing family caregiver engagement and supports. Linda Mims wears many hats. She is a serious mental illness and brain disease advocate, and also the vice chair of directors for the Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance. And then Shay Franco-Clausen is a family member with lived experience supporting family members with schizophrenia. And she has experience working with care population and has represented and advocated for consumers of the behavioral health and substance use disorder. And she's shown a strong commitment to strengthening the community. So we're pleased to have these individuals sharing their perspective and expertise. And I'll turn the time over to Barry to get us started. Barry?
Thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you all for being here today. It's really my pleasure to be here with Linda and Shay, two excellent experts with lived experience who I think will really bring some wonderful insights to some of the concepts that we'll be presenting today. So as Patricia explained, this presentation is in two halves, and the first half just has to do with the role of family members. I would broaden this to say not just the role of family members in the care process, but even prior to that, how do family members, what are the helpful things that family members do to help individuals with schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders? So next slide, please. So in order to illustrate some of the different scenarios we're going to be talking about in today's presentation, we have three imaginary individuals representing different types of individuals with different levels of severity of schizophrenia, but also with different family situations. And we're doing this by way of saying that families are different, individuals are different. And so as we go forward with this, we're going to be making lots of general comments, but every family has its own story, has its own circumstances. Different families will have different needs. So for the three examples here, let's start with Peter. And we'll say Peter is someone who is a gentleman and is around 40 years old. He's had schizophrenia for about 20 years. His schizophrenia has unfortunately been quite severe. And he has been living on the street for some time. He's been kind of in and out of contact with his parents over the years. His parents are very interested in supporting him, but they are also oftentimes don't know where he is and haven't had contact with him for a while. And in this case, the parents are the ones who have been the petitioners to engage Peter in the CARE Act process. So that's one example. Second example is Ronnie. Let's say that she's a transgender female who, in this imaginary scenario, has moderate acuity, and she is more interested in engaging in the CARE Act process, and is already working on developing a CARE Act plan with her behavioral health team. And she has some, her family support is rather mixed. The family members, like her sister, who's a volunteer supporter, want to support her and help her through the CARE Act process. There are other family members who object to some of her life choices, including her transgender status. So that's obviously a very different scenario. And then the third one would be Sandra here, and we can say that she's maybe been engaged in the CARE Act process for a while. Her symptoms are beginning to stabilize, and she is receiving services and benefiting from those services. However, because of a long family history of conflict and domestic violence, Sandra has virtually no contact with her family, and will go through the CARE Act process without family support. So again, this is by way of acknowledging that different families will have different situations and different needs. Next slide, please. So with those three scenarios in mind, I think let's talk just generally, and I want to give Shay's input as well, and Linda's input. So let's talk generally about how families assist an individual in the recovery process. And as you can see here on the slide, there are many different ways. And I think I just want to underscore a couple of them. One of the best things that families do is, because they have a long history of that person, they don't just know them as a person with schizophrenia. They know them as the person who, loves pets, or knows them as the person who loves chocolate cake, or knows them as the person who, when they were younger, were a star athlete. And because they don't identify the person and the disease as one entity, they are able to help the individual maintain their pre-illness self-identity. And that, I think, is an extremely important function. The other is they have the opportunity to just provide basic support, encouragement, cheerleading as that individual engages in recovery generally, and in the CARE Act process in specific. So before we go on, I wanted to get Shay and Linda's input about maybe their thoughts about the family's role in recovery.
I will say, as someone that has, 8 siblings that are dealing with this in many different ways, that sometimes just having someone else when there's a lot of family harm done, to be there to just remind them that this is a process. They have someone that believes and supports them, even on tough days. Is that you're saying, hey, I'm a partner in this process to recovery. And, I think it's very important for us to be there and to be patient. But also, I know that the situations are not ideal, but making sure that you're not only telling them that everything is going to be okay, you're going to work with them, but you're also having that type of energy when you're dealing with other providers and different services. So that's the one thing that I would say.
Thank you, Shay. Linda?
I would add that, when a person is this ill and they are, maybe they don't like you as a family member, maybe they have paranoia, it's very important for you to realize that the fact that your child or your loved one has gotten this disease is not your fault. This is a no-fault disease, and it's an equal opportunity disease. It's a brain disease, and it is treatable. So it's very important for family members to try to separate out the disease from the loving person you have raised, and also to not expect that person who was before the disease hit is going to come back in totality after treatment, and just giving them love, And any kind of reassurance that things will, I mean, sometimes you can't say things will be all right, but things definitely can get better if they are in treatment.
Thank you so much. I think those were two wonderful sets of comments to really get us going here. Next slide, please. So getting back to those three examples of Peter, Ronnie, and Sandra, what we can think about is that family support for each of these individuals with different levels of disease severity and different circumstances, different living environments, they're going to have family. What is family support for each of them is going to look different. Next slide, please. There are other factors that come into play when we think about a family's interaction with an individual with schizophrenia, or for that matter, that family's interaction with behavioral health providers or physical health providers. So one big factor that we're not going to be able to speak at any kind of length today is culture. And that is, people come from very different cultures. Those cultures have different beliefs, different attitudes towards mental illness in general, have different attitudes and beliefs about mental health treatments, and about who gets to make decisions. And so culture is really a fascinating field, a very complex field, given the number of different cultures that exist in California now. But that the most important thing is that as the behavioral health team approaches you and as a family, that they're respectful of your culture and of your expectations, that we want those behavioral health providers to take a stance of what we call cultural humility, not to make judgments about you, but to be curious and to want to learn from you about some of your expectations. And then by the same token, for you as family to be curious about the behavioral health providers' backgrounds and beliefs and expectations, maybe stemming from their training, maybe stemming from their culture, because culture does suffuse a lot of the interactions that occur around recovery. So that's one factor we want to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Another has to do with the whole legal framework of information sharing that exists within healthcare. I'm sure there's not a person on this call that hasn't heard about HIPAA. There may be many people on this call who have heard from a behavioral health provider that the behavioral health provider cannot share information with you about your relative because that information is protected under HIPAA or some other statute. So even though we may have cultural expectations, for instance, that everybody within the family gets to hear all the information, that's not the way the legal system is set up for handling healthcare information. So we have to always take this into account, and that many times it will prevent a provider from sharing information with a family member without the individual's consent. What is really important here about information sharing for the families to know, as well as for the behavioral health providers to remember, is that even if the behavioral health provider cannot share information to the family should always be able to share information with the behavioral health provider. Families have enormous and very, very important insights. They're observing the individual, how they're functioning. They may understand things about the individual that the professionals haven't quite learned yet. And so there always should be a means for the family to be able to share that information, even without the individual's consent. I always recommend to families that they put that information in written form. It's much more likely than to become part of the medical record. But families also should be aware that many providers will feel obliged to share the fact that you contacted them with the individual. And because the provider is not going to keep a secret from the individual that you may have written a letter to them. So that should be taken into account as you consider sharing information with a behavioral health provider. Next slide, please. And so let's talk now more specifically about the role of family in the CARE Act process. So as you know, we've already said in various ways that family members know the individual in ways that professionals may never know them. They may understand their personality, they may understand their preferences, and they understand their emotions, their sensitivities. They also may have had so much exposure to their symptoms over time that they may just be very familiar with their specific delusions or their specific hallucinations. And so that's really important information, in my opinion, speaking as a provider. That's really important information for providers to learn from family members in order to better understand and support the individual. So that's what my hope is for all family members, that you get to play this role of observer and sharer of information to really assist the treatment team in the CARE Act process. Next slide, please. There are other very specific roles that we should talk about. So, as you heard with the imaginary family of your parents of Peter, in which they are the petitioners for seeing whether that Peter is eligible for the CARE Act process. The petitioner role is a very specific role. There are supports through the self-help centers and through behavioral health agencies and the local NAMI affiliates to help people, family members, consider whether they want to make a petition, and if so, how to do so. But this is this is a part of the legal process. You know, the family members are often the ones who we anticipate will be the petitioners to begin this legal process. Next slide, please. The other very specific role, and I want to kind of distinguish this role in a moment, between being a volunteer supporter, which is a formal title, and then just being an informal supporter. That a volunteer supporter has some very specific things that they're expected to do to fulfill the role, as well as things that they should not do as a volunteer supporter. So a volunteer supporter, first of all, is an adult chosen by the individual for the purposes of helping ensure that respondents, that individuals' needs and preferences are well represented in the CARE Act process. And this is not exactly the same as being a family member, as we're going to talk about in a moment. But when the family member is playing this volunteer support role, when the individual has asked them to play this role, and the family member has agreed to play this role, as you can see on this slide, there are a number of different things that we're expecting them to do. We're expecting them to respect the individual's values, beliefs, and preferences, to abide by laws that protect individuals represented in the care population, and then to avoid conflicts of interest. We have done previous trainings, full hour trainings on the volunteer supporter role. If you want to learn more about this role, we have that training available through the link. And the other just important piece of this I'm going to just mention now, and we also have specific presentations on this, is that the family member is expected to use something called supported decision making. This again is where we are really doing all we can to support the respondent in their decision making process to whatever degree is possible. So next slide, please. One big component of being a volunteer supporter is to avoid what are called conflicts of interest. And conflicts of interest really is there are different ways we can think about a conflict of interest. So one would be if the volunteer supporter and the individual in the CARE Act process are simply not agreeing on things, not getting along, arguing incessantly. That's not helpful, right? And the court may remove that volunteer supporter if such a conflict of interest exists. And then the court may then advise the individual that they can choose someone else to be a volunteer supporter if, in fact, they want a volunteer supporter. There are other types of conflicts. Sometimes there's even financial conflicts. For instance, to give you an example, maybe the individual feels that for the good of their recovery, and maybe the behavioral health team feels for the good of the individual's recovery, it would be good for them to move out. But perhaps that family has been dependent upon that individual's Social Security check to help pay for rent or pay for other basic needs. And maybe the volunteer supporter is encouraging that individual to stay in the house for the family's good. Well, that too would be a conflict of interest that the court may decide that person who's a volunteer supporter needs to be removed from that role. So the volunteer supporter has to be aligned, has to be working closely with the individual to really help this process, not in any way be a barrier to this process. Next slide, please. And so I think that one of the major challenges with being a volunteer supporter is separating our historical relationship with this new role that we'd be stepping into as a volunteer supporter. If you're a parent, say, and maybe you have a trusted relationship with your child who has severe degree of schizophrenia, that trust is extremely important, and it will be important as a family member. It will be important if you are a volunteer supporter. However, as a family member, having this long history with the individual, and maybe the long history with the individual and their illness, that you may be viewing the individual through a specific way, in a specific light, through a lens of your previous relationship and circumstances. And that may lead you to form judgments or offer opinions, or, offer opinions saying, I think this would be better for you to do this versus that. Or if the individual, your child, is making a decision that you don't think is the right decision, for you to react emotionally. All those things are fine and really rather normal for a family member. However, they're not really ideal or really acceptable for a volunteer supporter. So in every instance here, we have to ask ourselves, can I do this? Can I take on this volunteer supporter role? Or would I rather just be a mom, rather just be a dad and be supportive in that way? What we're hoping to do, as you see in the question here, is harness the trust established in a historical relationship while minimizing emotional reactions. Easier said than done, but certainly something a family member may decide to do for the good of their child in this CARE Act process, if it's possible. Next slide, please. There are many times where family is not selected by an individual to be a volunteer supporter, or the individual decides that they don't want as a volunteer supporter. But that doesn't mean that family doesn't still play this important role as supportive, and we can call that as an informal supportive role, and that means that families still have a crucial role to play, and that means we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Next slide, please. We also want to acknowledge here, and we're just going to rush on this very lightly, but we could spend a great deal of time on this, and that having a family member with any severe illness, and in this case we're talking about schizophrenia, is very stressful for the family members. And that what we always worry about with individuals who are family caregivers in this instance is that they burn out, and that burning out means they have a loss of hope. They feel that they are kind of wearing down physically and emotionally. They feel like they're being overwhelmed, and that there are many resources available for avoiding burnout, preventing burnout for individuals caring for a loved one with schizophrenia. We're going to look at those in just a second. But I will say to you that what I always say to caregivers in my work is that this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. You know this far better than most of us. You've had a child who's had this terrible disease for decades, and that pacing and replenishing ourselves are really essential. So there's some ideas here for strategies for self-care, including unplugging from technology and having healthy habits. Next slide, please. And then on this slide, there are specific resources, including from NAMI, and then organizations, national organizations that support family caregivers, including the Caregiver Action Network, as well as the San Francisco-based Family Caregiver Alliance, about some self-care techniques that have been found to be effective for family caregivers in general, or more specifically for family caregivers of individuals who have schizophrenia. So again, we're just lightly brushing on this, but we do acknowledge that this is that this is hard on families, and that we want, the way, how well you support yourself will have an enormous impact on how well you're able to support your family member with schizophrenia. Next slide, please. So now I want to kind of turn back to Linda and Shay to get some of their input. We talked about a number of different barriers here. I'm just going to name them in the left-hand column again. That there's sometimes where there may be differences in cultural expectations between the family and the treatment team that may be a barrier to the family being able to work closely with that treatment team and be as helpful as they possibly can to the individual with schizophrenia. Or sometimes that individual doesn't provide consent, doesn't sign the HIPAA form to allow the treatment team to share information with the family. Or, as we just mentioned, that sometimes family members they're just fried, they're just burnt out, and they are having difficulty going forward. 3 significant barriers that would affect the family's role in the CARE Act. Shay and Linda, your thoughts about any of these barriers. Maybe Shay, you go first.
Well, thank you so much. So, like I said, as someone who's actively working with many different layers of dealing with mental health, schizophrenia, but also chronic addiction and incarceration, for me, it's like trying not to feel guilt when I'm burnt out, when I've had to meet with, probation officers or mental health experts within custody, or looking for housing for one of my brothers, and dealing with the barriers that sometimes, I'm not his parent, but I am his caregiver as for all my siblings. Sometimes I have to take care of myself first and not feel guilt around that. Because I'm not good for him if I have a little animosity, that I'm exhausted and I'm tired. And, I have 5 kids of my own that I'm responsible for. So I want to give family members like the space to center yourself and your mental health and not feel guilt around that. Because it does create this this unconscious feeling that you have when you're having meetings. And it sometimes doesn't help your loved one when they can also feel that tension and they're dealing with their own, inabilities to understand and barriers. So I just want to give you all permission to do self-care. Take a time out and stop and breathe and pull yourself together and get yourself better, and have no guilt associated, because you're doing so much for your loved one, and it is so time consuming and it impacts so many areas of your life. Just, center yourself in order to be able to center them.
Thank you, Shay. I think if we could ban guilt, the world would be a better place. In some ways, maybe in other ways, it would be a worse place, but mostly would be a better place. So anyway, Linda, your thoughts.
Well, I just want to piggyback on Shay's comments. It is so important to take care of yourself. And many of our families, we have other family members, we have siblings that are seeing what's happening to their sister or brother. And this is a family disease. Schizophrenia is a family disease. And so you're not only taking care of your sick child, you're having to take care of the rest of the members of your family. And when I say you, I'm predominantly mean the parents in many situations. So to be able to forge relationships with the care team, you need to go in there as calmly as possible, because you are going to be frustrated many times. It is a hard job to forge these relationships to get the medically necessary care you need for your sick loved one. And this is a pretty terrifying disease. And so I would say to you that a support group, if you can find one, and there are so many out there, to actually share your honest feelings about what's going on with your family can be a real lifesaver. And I'm speaking from experience. So I'll leave it at that, because I know Barry needs to get going on the rest of the slides. But if you have any questions, you can tune in tomorrow and we can discuss these things further.
Thank you, Linda. Next slide, please. So the second section we're going to talk about here are some specific, I'm going to say suggestions for families. One of the things I don't want anybody to come away with is that we're telling anybody that what they're doing may necessarily be wrong, because every family situation is different. But consider these ideas for you to consider that may be helpful in your family situation. So next slide, please. So there are 5 steps here, and we're going to go into them in a little bit of depth in a moment. But these are just some things to think about in supporting your family member as they go through the CARE Act process. So let's jump right into it. Next slide, please. So step one is to do whatever you can to develop a collaborative partnership with your individual's mental health providers. So, one thing we there's that old saying, it takes 2 to tango. And that means you can do your best to be open to relating to that person with your individuals, with your relatives' consent. You can be open to sharing information to them. And then that behavioral health provider needs to be interested in collaborating with you, interested in the information that you have to provide, receptive to your ideas. That's really where I think collaboration comes in, when you have 2 parties that want to work together. So all you can do is your part to help foster what we're calling here a triangle of care. And that is, you're not telling the mental health providers what to do, but you're trying to be a participant in this process, to be a partner, providing your observation, what you've learned from experience, and so you're not an expert on the individual, and you have lots of information. Let me just qualify before I put my foot in my mouth. You have tremendous expertise about the individual that you're caring for. But that the idea here is that everybody needs to work together. The individual, the behavioral health providers, and the family members need to work together to put their heads together to really cull their collective wisdom to figure out how best to help that individual gain from the CARE Act process and really enter into a more beneficial recovery than perhaps they had previously. And so that takes humility, that takes a level of openness. And so that's first step here. And when it works wonderfully well. And it's a fantastic thing. It doesn't always work. And that's a topic that we could conjecture about for a while, but it's one that each of us can only do the best that we can to be open and collaborative. Next slide, please. Second step here is that as family members, the role is your role really, whether you're a volunteer supporter or not, you're trying to support the individual with their goals and their recovery, and not necessarily what you think is best for them. And this is one of the toughest things, because the individuals that we're caring for sometimes, in our opinion, don't have the best judgment, but we still have to be as respectful as possible to their right to make decisions, and the hopes that they're going to make the decisions which are ultimately good for them, ultimately healthy for them. And so we want to do our best to support and respect their decision-making rights. We want to help them think through the consequences of their actions, perhaps by using what is called a problem-solving approach. And, problem-solving approach is just a fancy term to say that we sit down and we help people make a list of what are the pros and cons of any one decision that they may make, so that they're making the most informed decision possible. And then there's another technique which is often helpful, called a backwards planning technique. And we say to our individual, well, what do you want? What do you want the goal to be? What do you want to happen in the end? And maybe I want to live separate in my own apartment with some supports. And then, okay, so that's the goal. Now, what are the steps that have to happen in order to reach that goal? And so you use that goal as a motivator, and then have to think through concretely what needs to occur to reach that place. And so in either case, the idea is to be supportive, not to block the individual's right to make their own decisions. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of, the third one here is reassess communication and relationship patterns. And so there's a lot of research to suggest that when family members are supportive of individuals with schizophrenia, those individuals do better in their recovery. And by the flip side of that is when there's more conflict, when the family is angrier, it expresses more hostility or criticism towards the individual with schizophrenia, then that person generally does not do as well with their disease. I think that there's a kind of certain common sense element to this, that when we treat people well, they thrive. When we feel angry at them and maybe point out things in a way which is a little harsh, then they don't feel good, and they pull back from us, but they also don't do as well with their illness. Next slide, please. Number 4 is develop a deeper understanding of schizophrenia and lived experience. Living with someone who has schizophrenia, you learn a lot, but then it's also important to take that firsthand experience that you're having, and then to learn more about the disease itself, to learn more about the disease's typical course, to learn more about its potential treatments, and what are the good, what are maybe the side effects of some of those treatments, and what other possibilities are there for helping your family member live as well as they possibly can with schizophrenia. Family psychoeducation is one way of developing this deeper understanding of schizophrenia. And next slide, please. And number 5 is really planning together as a family support network. And what I mean by this is it's stressful. You heard Shay and Linda say how stressful it is caring for an individual with schizophrenia, and that is occurring, as Linda points out, while there are other family needs. Everybody in the family has needs, and it's not just that person who has this terrible disease. And so how, as a family, can you sit down and develop a plan of mutual support for one another, and where perhaps you divvy up some of the responsibilities among family members for supporting the individual with schizophrenia, and not have it all fall on one person's shoulders. So an example would be, maybe one person will drive the individual one day to therapy, and maybe someone else will drive them another day, or to their clubhouse, or whatever therapeutic program they're going to. And so this family communication and cooperation and organization really helps family caregiving go better. So those are 5 steps. Went through rather quickly, but just wanted to, there's some general ideas. They're not going to fit every circumstance or every individual, but they're just some general ideas. Next slide, please. And so I want to again turn to Linda and Shay, and let's try to apply some of these actions and maybe other ideas that Linda and Shay have for supporting the individuals, helping the families of Peter, Ronnie, and Sandra, the 3 imaginary individuals we talked about before, helping those families help those individuals. So you may recall that Peter has the most severe form of schizophrenia of the 3 individuals on the slide, and he has been in and out of contact with the family for a long time and is currently homeless. Ronnie is a moderate degree of severity, and has her sister is volunteer supporter, but the family has mixed support because of her transgender status. And then Sandra, who has been in the care process for a while, her symptoms are beginning to resolve, but she does not have any family support. So Linda, let me throw this to you first. Thoughts about what actions the families of these individuals could or should take?
Well, I would say that, it all depends on, again, what you're calling acuity. So if a person has been sick for a long time and they are coming out of that illness or coming out of psychosis, I think it's important for families to try to realize that this is terrifying for that individual. They are coming out of a place where everything they thought they were doing that was right and based on reality was actually not. It was based on delusions and paranoia and other symptoms of schizophrenia. So you need to put yourself in the place of your loved one and think how terrifying that would be. And what can I do to reassure my loved one that they are still loved, that that was their brain disease acting out, not them as a person. They're still themselves. They are still a great person. They are still somebody who deserves to be loved. That's the first thing I would say. And then it really, again, depends on each of these different situations has different answers. But the overall is that parents and families, this is a hard job dealing with psychosis. And you can only do the best you can. But the more you learn about schizophrenia and the symptoms, et cetera, the etiology, the better off you will be to help your loved one.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
I want to echo that for Linda. We all have different situations, and our experiences don't look the same when we're dealing with Peter, Ronnie, and Sandra. The intersectionalities of issues, meaning if they're dealing with LGBT issues, being placed in the right space where we're not using their dead name, or which could trigger them, and we're not providing the support they need as transgender individuals, can also cause some problems where you can be the advocate for them and partner with other organizations that are doing the work in your prospective communities, like Santa Clara County. We have an Office of LGBT Affairs that can be a partner in making sure we get the right support. We also have in Santa Clara County is support around schizophrenia within the justice system, meaning within the county's correctional facilities, partnering with the organizations that are partnering there. If your loved one faces, chronic incarceration, I think Peter, Ronnie, and Sandra look different. And when it comes to, areas of support, I think we just have to say, who are those partner organizations that understand those intersectional issues when dealing with someone who is coming through treatment, is doing well, to be very honest about their experiences in these other areas, so that your support is really for their whole person, not just one portion of them. And I say that because it's really hard when there is no parents or relatives to support, and a sibling becomes the responsible party for not just your siblings, but your parents as well. It looks different. The age looks different, and their experience looks different. So I think that considering that when you are supporting someone that is dealing with this type of mental health, just to make it a little bit easier on yourself. And I know that they're going to give some information about tools and suggestions, but really consider looking at what your county offers to also be able to support.
Great. Thank you, Shay and Linda. I appreciate your input. Next slide. So just to summarize what we've been talking about today, what we really want to stress strongly that families have a very important role in the recovery of individuals with schizophrenia. They could play, with the individual's consent, they could play a central role in that recovery. Specifically looking at the care process, family members can play the distinct roles of being a petitioner, a volunteer supporter, or continue providing informal support. Some family members may play all three roles. Someone may only play one role, but in each of those roles, families can make a big difference. And that we mentioned a number of different strategies and tools that families can use in supporting individuals with schizophrenia, including giving education about schizophrenia, and really developing those strong partnerships, if possible, with behavioral health providers, and really by supporting themselves, by practicing self-care, so that they remain resilient and continue to be there, to be present, and to be caring, and to be active on behalf of that individual with schizophrenia. So that I'd like to turn this back to Patricia now. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Barry, Shay, and Linda. And for the participants, thanks for joining and learning more about the role of the family and the care act. Our goal is that you would be able to better define the key concepts related to the family's role in the care process, and then outline some key action steps that families can take. We wanted to highlight a few resources for you. On our CARE Act website, we have resources including recordings of past trainings and to submit questions and technical assistance, and also consider joining our communication listserv for upcoming notices about resources, training opportunities, and what's happening. Also wanted to point out a resource on the CARE Act website, the Volunteer Supporter Toolkit. We have, and this is specifically for those volunteer supporter roles, that can be helpful to families and better understand the care process in general, even if you are playing one of those informal support roles. And then wanted to point out some additional trainings for you if you want to seek out more information on the care process. We have an overview of the care process, updates on the care plan and agreement support, supported decision-making, which Barry mentioned, and some other trainings that we hope will be helpful for you as you're supporting someone going through the care process. There is no wrong door. We wanted to share our email address with you. Please reach out if you have questions. We may not always have the answer, but we'll do our best to connect you with the right person. So there is no wrong door here. So thank you for attending this training, and please reach out if you have any additional questions.